Good afternoon or morning, depending on your location. Thank you all for joining us for the Oracle EPM 11.2 Installation Tips and Tricks webcast. For any questions, please be sure to use the Q&A box. All questions will be logged, and I'll be sure to have someone from my team get back to you within 24 hours with answers. Quick note, we now have the ability for closed captions. In the right-hand side of your screen, you should see the CC icon. To view closed captions, just hit the CC icon. Today's webinar will load and begin shortly. Let's get started.
Today we're going to be discussing the installation of Oracle EPM 11.2X. First, we want to say a few things about Interrel. And first of all, my name is Eldred Smichael. I am a senior consultant at Interrel. And here are some of the goals for Interrel, just to introduce you to 11.2 installation, some of the tips and tricks that we learned with this version, and hopefully give you a little bit of insight during your installation process. And if you have any questions, we will be available to answer those. You can always email us at Interrel, and we would get back to you as soon as we could to answer any follow-up questions on this session.
Actually, Eldred, just quick. People can ask questions in the little chat window, so I'll be checking them. So if I see that, like, for example, someone asks what's the current release for 11.2, right? So you can, I'll field those as I can.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, David.
All right.
Okay, so here is some of the awards that Interrel has been presented from Oracle. So just a little bit about the company and some of the history. And as I was saying, here is our agenda for the webcasts. So we have the EPM 11.2 tips and tricks today. And then coming in March, we have the scenario planning. And also in March, the best of solutions for EPM keynotes. And then in April, new EDM features. Let's get started with the overview for EPM 11.2. So first thing we want to note is that some of the products that we are accustomed to in 11.1 versions have been removed from 11.2. Some of those products are the EPM Architect, the simplified interface, and some of the prepackaged planning applications have been removed, as well as performance scorecard, and the underlying technology for reporting and analysis has been modified. So we don't have any of the older products from 11.1.2.4. So here's a list. This is what we currently have that's been removed. And there are more products that will be removed with the later versions. So we'll go into that a little later. Okay, so first we want to do a quick comparison of the versions of 11.2. So it is now up to version 11.2.4. So version 11.2.0 came out in December of 2019, and version 11.2.4 came out in December of 2020, which we're just going to refer to as Q4 2020. So the original version, 11.2.0 as well as 11.2.1, only supported Windows operating systems. So the support for Linux operating systems didn't happen until version 11.2.2. And at this point, version 11.2.4 supports Windows Server 2016 and Windows Server 2019, as well as Oracle and Red Hat Linux version 7. Okay. Okay, so as I was saying, version 11.2.4 is the latest release. It came out late last year. So this is the release that is currently GA on the Oracle eDelivery site. So if you log into eDelivery, you can now download this version. It is available to the public. 11.2.4 is an upgrade for the 11.2 series. However, you could not upgrade 11.2.0 or 11.2.1 in place. Now you can upgrade 11.2.2 and 11.2.3 to the latest version as an upgrade. Those can be in place upgrades to this latest release. 11.2.0 and 11.2.1 would have to be upgraded to at least version 11.2.2 before they could be upgraded to 11.2.4. Some of the new features for 11.2.4 are in planning. There are several new features for planning in this release. And as I mentioned earlier, reporting and analysis has been completely rewritten in this version. So that took out some of the underlying components, mainly the file-based components for reporting and analysis, and everything is now contained in the RDBMS. So therefore, the migration of financial reports has changed. So you can't use LCM to migrate the reports because the underlying components are different. It is possible to migrate reports, but when 11.2 came out originally, the documentation stated that it was not possible to migrate reports, and that meant utilizing LCM. Okay, so as I was also saying, version 11.1.2.4, the older version, requires an out-of-place upgrade to get to the 11.2 versions of the software. So you're not going to be able to utilize the same hardware that you currently have if you're on 11.1.2.4. And if you're on the older versions, 11.1.2.3, you would have to upgrade to 11.1.2.4 first before you can migrate your data into 11.2.x. So 11.2.4 supports various browsers. It's Microsoft Edge, Google Chrome, and Firefox. So these are the latest browsers that are out, and they're all supported by 11.2.4. It also supports the latest JDK, which is Oracle's JDK 1.8. It also supports the TLS 1.2 protocol. And with the older version of 11.1.2.4, TLS 1.2 was available, but it required an upgrade of OHS. And 11.2.4 comes with TLS support out of the box. The RDBMSs that are supported by 11.2.4, Microsoft SQL Server 2016, and Oracle versions 11G, 12C, and 19C. For the users upgrading from 11.1.2.4, the user interface will be very familiar, as Oracle didn't really change the user interface for this version. That part should be relatively intuitive for any clients using 11.1.2.4. Okay, next are the installation steps. Okay.
Hey, Eldred.
Yes.
We're getting a lot of questions about reporting, so maybe we should touch on that. So a lot of people are asking about whether or not reports will be, if they're going to have to rewrite them, or if they're not going to be available once you upgrade.
Okay.
Maybe you may want to touch on that.
Okay. So we will answer the reporting questions at this point. So that was a very good question when 11.2 came out, and we didn't know whether or not we would have to rewrite each and every single report once this version was released. And the actuality was we did not. We were able to utilize the classic way of migrating reports, which did not utilize LCM. You could simply zip up your reports and then import those zip files into 11.2. It would create your data sources to HFM, planning, or Essbase during that import process, and then you could actually run your reports. So it did not bring over any folder level security, but the reports themselves would actually work. It was a manual process to put the security back in place, but a lot less work than having to rewrite each and every one of your reports. So the reports can be migrated just with not utilizing LCM, just doing it the older way for the migration. Any other questions around reporting, David?
Yeah, so if you have financial reports that are going against HFM, those should be fine, as long as you migrate them like Eldred just said. And as far as Essbase is concerned, as long as the Essbase is tied to a planning application, those will be fine against FR. But you can't have Essbase 11.2, Essbase only cubes on 11.2. But we won't get into the licensing aspect of that, but essentially you would have to upgrade to 19C or 21C of Essbase in order to have reports go against those.
All right.
Go ahead, Eldred.
Okay. Okay. So we're back to our installation steps. So first steps for the installation would be the server prep. And this is installation at a glance. So we then would need to download the software. And once we get the software downloaded and extracted, we then install the software. Once the installation portion is complete, we then configure the software. And after our configuration, our environment is then ready for what we call from a high-level functional test. So that's where we go in and just make sure all the communication of the products works and everything actually does what we expect it to do. Okay, so for the server prep, first things that I have to do, and this is in the Oracle documentation as well, is you have to disable the UAC. And sometimes it's done on the servers prior to, sometimes you have to ask a server administrator for assistance there. Sometimes you can actually do it yourself. Usually in this landscape with security being so tight, is something that server administrators usually have to help you with, because sometimes there's actually a group policy that sets that. So you may need assistance. Another piece that is in the Oracle documentation, and we run into a lot these days, is we need to disable the antivirus. And this is in the documentation, but sometimes this meets resistance from the IT team. Usually the way we get through that resistance is simply ask them to temporarily disable the antivirus software while we do our installation configuration. and testing, and then they can put it back. Another piece that's not as critical, but something that I like to do during server prep is to check the DNS resolution. And there is a utility that comes with the software that helps you to check this piece. And the reason I like to check that is because we now try to configure the software so it is not dependent on IP addresses. So you want to configure with the domain names. And sometimes on the round trip to and from one particular server, the domain name will be resolved into the underlying IP address. So you don't want that to happen during your configuration, because you would end up with IP addresses in your data, and then you're no longer IP address agnostic. You're dependent on that, and you don't want that. And then lastly, you just have to ensure that the account you're utilizing to do your software installation is a local administrator on each of your machines, Oracle/Hyperion machines, where you're implementing 11.2. Okay? All right, so server prep, first step would be to download the software. So this is done by logging into the Oracle eDelivery site, and you will need a valid Oracle account to access the site. Once you get into the Oracle eDelivery site, you can simply search on the EPM 11.2 software, and it will bring up the various versions that are available for Oracle EPM software. As you see here, this is the older version with 11.1 still available, and 11.2 is in this list also. So you would simply pick the one that you are installing and then go to the download site on the eDelivery and download it to your local machine. Once you've downloaded the software, you would then unzip or extract the software into a centralized location. So you can put all of the extracted binaries in one file location because they are dependent on each other. And then you'll be able to run the install tool without any error. So you download the software, extract the software to a central location, and then execute the install tool.cmd to kick off your installation. Okay. Once the installation is started, you have to go through the splash screen, the welcome screen. It lets you know that everything on the server is okay. You get green check boxes everywhere. And then you finally get to the screen where you select the components that you want to install on that particular machine. So first machine usually is the machine where you're going to install your foundation services. So that is the picture that we have here on the right, is we're selecting the foundation components to install on our first machine. Okay. Okay. Once we get through the process of installing the software on our desired machines, we then have to run the RCU. So in the older versions, 11.1.x, the RCU was not a requirement. But with 11.2.x, the RCU is now a requirement for each and every machine in your environment. So this will have to be run multiple times in a distributed environment. So we kick off the RCU, and the first thing that we need to actually be successful with our repository creation is DBA privileges for the account that we use. So the RCU will be kicked off, and you're usually going to have to get the DBA to work with you here to put in DBA credentials, and then the RCU will be able to do its job creating the schemas that it needs to support the EPM products. So that's a new step with 11.2 that's required. And this is just showing you some of the schemas that the RCU creates. As you see on the right, you will give them a prefix for that particular machine, and then it will do its job in creating the schemas for that particular machine in the RDBMS. Okay. Once the RCU has completed its work, you then have a subsequent step where you need to go in and update an RCU schema.properties file. And this file is actually accessed during your configuration of your components. This is what it utilizes to actually do your web deployment for your WebLogic servers. So it will access this file, then it can access the RCU schemas, and then it allows you to create your WebLogic servers. As you see here with the second bullet, if this file isn't updated with the sysdba and all of your database connection string information, then the configuration of your WebLogic servers will fail on the deployment phase. You will have to come back and get this information and then redo that step. And as you see with the file on the right, once it utilizes the file, it then encrypts the information that it used. So the sysdba password and the schema password will be encrypted from that point forward within this file. So once we get through the RCU portion, we can then configure the components that we have installed on that particular machine. Once again, I'm sticking with the foundation components. So these are the steps that we would use, and the checkboxes show the steps that we would utilize, and these should be familiar because these were utilized in the older versions as well to configure your components on this particular server. And as I was saying here, each component will have its own configuration requirements. In this case, it's just shared services or foundation services. So we don't have anything extra to do there. And you should be very familiar, as I was saying, because this is the way that this worked with the older versions also. And then once we get through the configuration for all of the components, we then go into our testing phase. So this is where we actually start all of our services, and then we select the browser that we want to use, and we access the components that we've installed and configured. For us, in this case, we've actually accessed Workspace. So this lets us know that it's actually up and running. The communication with the database is okay, and the communication with the RCU schemas is also okay. So everything is communicating at this point because we're able to get into our workspace for 11.2. Okay. Some lessons learned from this version. So we've learned a few. Okay. First one is one that is very common, where at some point in the life of the EPM software, the sysdba or the Hyperion administrator decides that there needs to be a password change for security reasons. It happens quite often in the field. So with the older versions, at one point, going way back with the older versions, you wouldn't be able to change the admin password for shared services. But then with the later versions, 11.124, you could change that password going through the user interface, and that was allowed. That change would then propagate through the system and you would be fine. Okay, with the addition of RCU, now that information is not only stored in files on the particular server, foundation server, it's also stored in the RCU schemas. So you can no longer go through the user interface and change the password for your admin accounts. It's a little bit more challenging. And as I say here in this one, significant challenges in changing the password. So you have to use the WebLogic translation language to actually change your password for your admin accounts. And that will update the information in your RCU schemas for you. Once that piece has been done, you would then have to manually go in and update your WebLogic data sources. So that also is a new twist. So it takes a little bit of work to modify the password for your admin accounts in this version. Another lesson learned is 11.2 utilizes SBase 11.1.2.4 with this release. The APS Analytic Provider Services needs to be patched in release 11.2.2. The patch is actually an 11.1.2.4 patch that allows APS to function properly. Without the patch, APS cannot add your SBase server from within the EAS console. Once you apply the patch, it then puts the proper files in place for APS to function in its communication with SBase. And as I was saying, APS and SBase are both from the version 11.1.2.4. So that particular patch is required in 11.2.2 for APS. Next bullet goes into that a little bit more. SBase is still 11.1.2.4. So the SBase 11.1.2.4 components do still work. An example of that is also the SBase Studio console. SBase Studio console does not come with 11.2.x out of the box, but the SBase Studio console 11.1.2.4 does still work with this version. And I say with this version because the firmware that this version is on has been upgraded to 12.2.1.3 from the older version with 11.1.2.4, which was 11.1.1.7. So this is newer, but
that's the older Fusion middleware.
Go ahead.
Fusion middleware.
Fusion middleware. What did I say?
You said firmware.
I'm sorry. Fusion middleware. Okay. And then the next point or lesson learned that we have here is when we install the SBase client, which can be required for various components such as ODI, FDM-EE, things of that nature. Those client components have not been upgraded to 11.2. Some of them are still the older versions of the client to communicate with SBase. And an example is the SBase client. when you install the Essbase client 11.2x, under the hood, it installs Essbase client 11.1.2.4. And therefore, it makes modifications to your environment, changing the JDK that it utilizes to be the older JDK 1.6. And this is done in the set Java runtime file. So once the Essbase client has been installed, you will manually have to go into that particular file and change it back to the correct version of the JDK that's installed. And that version is the JDK 1.8. We've also seen that the ons.jar file had to be renamed to configure products with shared services. Products were not being registered properly until the ons.jar file was renamed on the foundation server. And finally, lesson learned. We've run into an issue with HFM and calculation manager rules in the version 11.2.3. This is actually a bug that Oracle is currently working on to resolve. But the issue is HFM is not able to utilize calculation manager rules. So in version 11.2.3, HFM was forced to utilize classic rules, not calculation manager rules. And that, as I said, is a bug that Oracle is currently working on. Okay.
Hey, Eldred, quick question.
Yes.
Someone's asking if you can clarify the point you made, I think bullet 1, about the password changes with WebLogic and databases.
Clarify it?
Yeah, like is there an issue? Like, what can they change it? Like, because obviously I'm guessing there's a lot of people who have
yes,
probably requirements to change database passwords every 60 days, 90 days, whatever.
Yes.
Are you saying there's an issue? Yeah, maybe you could touch on that.
Okay. I'll try to do my best to touch on it. So the normal process starts with the database. So the DBA will want to change the database, let's just say every 90 days or so. What that does is it takes down your Oracle EPM environment because it can no longer access those RCU schemas that it needs. So typically you can go into the configurator and update the password for your other EPM products, such as Foundation, and that would be sufficient. But with 11.2, you also have to update the password to access those RCU schemas. So since the DBA has already changed the password on the database side, on the back end, you first have to access those RCU schemas before you can configure everything else. And it can be done, yes. The first step in that process is to update the password for WebLogic, because to run 11.2.x, one part of the process is starting the WebLogic admin server first. And then you start your node manager service. And then you start your OHS component. And that's how you access Workspace. But in that process, the WebLogic admin server has to start first. So when the DBA changed the password, you would have to get that access back to start WebLogic. So to change the password for WebLogic after the DBA has already done his job, you have to utilize WLST, which will go into all of the files for the admin account, and that will modify the password for you there. Then you have to go into the data sources that were originally created when you did your original configuration. There are data sources that connect to each RCU schema. So the passwords have to manually be modified there as well. Once that's done, you then have access to the database again. So you would start your WebLogic admin server with the new password, and that would start. That would give you access to all of your components at that point to be reconfigured and changing password for everything else downstream. So it does work. It's just quite a bit more challenging and quite a few more steps.
Great, thanks.
Okay.
Is that it? Okay.
At our conclusion.
I've been doing my best to answer questions as they come in.
Okay.
You've gotten a lot of them. I think
Yes.
We've gone through like 28 questions. So that's good. A lot of people are interested. I don't think there's anything outstanding, but if anyone does have any, let me see. Okay,
well, thank you, David.
Yep.
Okay. So in conclusion, the 11.2.x version is much more integrated with the WebLogic domain, and that is due to the utilization of RCU. That's why some of these components are a little more challenging to reconfigure after the fact, is because RCU is in the equation with this version. So you just have to keep that in mind, especially during troubleshooting. We're finding out that RCU is playing a pretty major role, and you can actually utilize the configuration tools for the WebLogic domain to update your RCU information as well. So it's much more integrated with this release. And as I mentioned earlier, as far as the S-base side of it, a lot of the 11.1.2.4 components still work with S-base specifically. Everything else is on the Fusion middleware 12.2.1.3, and that is also the version for this release of WebLogic. So that utilizes TLS 1.2. But S-base is still 11.1.2.4. So all of the surrounding components, products that utilize 11.1.2.4 will still work. And all the patches that have been applied to those versions, you can still apply in this release for S-base products. And then just looking forward, both EAS and S-base Studio will be removed from future releases. And you can see this in S-base 21C documentation, and S-base Studio is due to be removed with 11.2.6. release. So those two products will be going away in the future.
Hey, Eldred.
Yes.
Someone's asking, and I don't think I know the answer to this, if Oracle's providing any more time or extension for clients that are not able to upgrade by the end of 2021.
What was the question again, David?
So I guess if they are not able to upgrade to 11.2 by 2021, since end of life support is 2021, December, they're asking, is Oracle providing extensions that you know of? I don't think so, but.
And unfortunately, I do not know the answer to that one.
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay, so this concludes our 11.2 overview. So are there any other questions?
Let's see, do older versions of SmartView still work on 11.2?
So the supported version of SmartView, very good question, by the way, is 11.125.910 or the new 20 series. So from what I've seen in the field, lessons learned, 11.125.900 actually works with 11.2.x, but the support matrix only goes as far back as 11.125.910. So that's the supported version for SmartView with this release.
Great, thanks. Now there's another question asking if there are any tips or tricks for 11.2 upgrade to DRM or DRG. Let you know.
So with DRM, you have to utilize DRM if you're going from EPMA. As far as DRM, upgrading DRM, it is essentially the same process with the older release for DRM. You can upgrade DRM using the same steps that you did with the older releases for DRM.
Right, and just, because they mentioned DRG, the 11.2 version of DRM, keep in mind, is a limited use version of DRM, only meant to be used for planning HFM, the components that are inside of EPM. So if you have full-blown version of DRM, you wouldn't want that version of DRM because that would be this particular 11.2 version of DRM is kind of limited use license of DRM.
Yes, open licensing. Thanks, David.
So so technically within that limited use license, DRG is not included as part of that. Let's see.
Any more questions?
No, I'm kind of reading through them, so there's a few more. Hold on. Can we use HFR to connect to ASO queues for reporting purposes with 11.2?
Can we use HFR to connect to ASO queues?
I guess they mean if they're S-based only queues. I think.
And the answer is yes. The FR data source for S-base still works. So you can connect to both BSO and ASO queues for reporting. It still works.
But if it's, again,
right,
yes,
the licensing.
There is a licensing limitation. So we recommend you talk to your Oracle rep about it, because technically you're not supposed to be going against S-based only queues.
Right.
Now, if it's an ASO queue that's tied to your planning queue, to your planning application, then you should be able to do that.
Then you should not, right?
Oh, they're asking. Oh, this is a good question. They're asking about, which they must know about this if they're asking. They're asking about the start and stop for OHS pane. Any suggestions?
Yes. So OHS is now started and managed through the node manager. So it can be called through scripting. What you need to do originally, though, is set up the user and password for it. So my technique is to call OHS the first time through a command line. And during that first call, I can put in a parameter at the very end of the line that says store user config. And that sets up a file under my profile that has the password for OHS. Once that's done, I can then subsequently just call it from a script, and I don't have to put in the password for OHS at that point. So it'll start because I did the store user configuration the first time. So once I've done it, I can then set it up for a script to start OHS. And of course, you would have to set up your administration server as a service also. Node Manager is automatically going to be a service. So once those two are started and you call your start script, OHS will start at that point.
But in terms of how it used to be, where it was easily set up as a Windows service, those days are over.
Yep, and that's true. I didn't compare, and that's right. But that's the difference. Is before this was simply a Windows service that you had after your configuration, so that was much more simple. Now going through the Node Manager, it's a little bit more challenging to start it with scripting, but it can be done.
Yep. Another question they have is, does 11.2, that one I'm not sure about. Is 11.2 planning support smart push from VSO to ASO? I'm not sure about that, but you can.
Neither am I.
Okay. Can we connect SmartView to directly to connected S-based only cubes and planning cubes? I think we could always do that. Yeah, the SmartView hasn't changed, right? The SmartView has always kind of been its own product.
Right. SmartView has not changed. SmartView is still consistent as it was with the older version. Still works in the same way.
The answer is no to Smart Push, by the way. Someone actually answered that.
Okay.
Let's see. I answered that. Does ODI 11.119 work with 11.2 for dimension maintenance?
So my experience is it does not. So I have not done a 11G ODI in conjunction with 11.2. I've only done the 12C, ODI 12C implementation, and it works seamlessly with 11.2. Now, ODI 12C is a little different than the 11G version. If you're using the standalone agent with 12C, it also has to be deployed as the J2EE agent has to be deployed. With the older 11G version, the standalone agent did not have to be deployed. It was not a piece of the WebLogic domain, but with ODI 12C, it is. But ODI 12C does work with 11.2, and I'm really testing my memory, but I do believe that the 11G version does not work because of the TLS 1.2.
Okay, so it's security based. Okay.
Yeah, I could be wrong, but I don't think it works.
Let's see. What about the audit history on the report? Yeah, I think someone asked again about the S-Base only connections with reports.
Okay.
From a technical perspective, they work, but they're not licensed to. You're not supposed to do it from a license perspective.
Yep, I'm giving the technical perspective where it works, and David is giving the licensing perspective. Like, please don't do it.
Does planning and S-Base knowledge modules work from ODI 12C to 11.2? I believe so, but I'm not. Well, actually, I'm not sure. 12C knowledge modules. Actually, this is a good point because ODI does upgrade from the older version to this version. If you have FDME, right? The ODI version that comes with FDME 11.2 is 12C. So if you already have 12C and you're using it against planning and S-Base, I guess the question is, will those knowledge modules work going forward if they upgrade S-Base and planning to 11.2? I assume they would, but I don't know.
Yes. I know that implementation that I did have the knowledge modules, and they worked with S-Base, which essentially is still 11.1.2.4. So the question whether S-Base is upgraded to 19C or 21C?
Right.
Then I don't know the answer if S-Base is upgraded to one of those later releases. I don't know.
Okay. I mean, someone did ask what would be the replacement of VAS going forward. I guess they're asking relative to 19C and 21C.
Right.
There is an EAS Lite version that's out there, but if you go to our Interel YouTube channel, you'll find a good amount of information. Actually, Glenn Schwartzberg did a webinar recently that goes into S-Base 21C and kind of how it looks and feels, as well as the replacement of EAS within that environment.
Right. And I know with 21C, you have the EAS Lite, and it does not have the full functionality that EAS Classic has at 11.1.2.4 because S-Base itself has changed. So moving forward past that, they're going to the UI web interface for that functionality. So it's all changing. Any more questions, David?
Oh, one person's asking, they're getting ready to do an upgrade. Is there any reason to not go to the most current release of 11.2.4?
David, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see any reason why you wouldn't want it. Like, because all these versions, right? 11.2.1, 11.2.2, 11.2.3, 11.2.4. Every time it comes out with a new version, those fixes are cumulative, right? So anything they fix in the other versions obviously are included in the latest version.
Right.
So if I had to choose a version to upgrade to, obviously I would probably opt for the latest version because it has the most fixes.
Right. We'll go with no reason to not go to the latest release.
Right. Aside from if you're concerned about being on the cutting edge, which a lot of people do.
And also keep in mind with HFM, if you use Calc Manager rules, if you have HFM and you use Calc Manager rules, there were no updates to Calc Manager in 11.2.3 or in 11.2.4. So until Oracle fixes that particular bug, if you use Calc Manager rules, the latest release that would be viable would be 11.2.2.
Right. Here goes another question. They're asking, with the all the deprecated components, are there any replacement functionality being provided?
That is a very challenging question in the sense that there's so many deprecated components.
And I don't think so. I mean, in some cases they got rid of them just because they were hardly ever being used.
Right.
In other cases, there are newer tools to do those things. Like for example, like if you use what was the thing that the reporting that people never used, but it was always included on EPM. It wasn't interactive reporting; it was the other one. But that, essentially you can do similar kind of dashboarding and things with other Oracle tools like OBIEE or Essbase, or OAC on the cloud. And a lot of the, I guess, workforce planning, they're asking about workforce planning, capital asset planning, public sector, all those modules, I guess, that used to be part of planning.
Right. So I know with 11.2.4, they brought back the planning, public sector, and budgeting if it didn't do one particular process, then it's viable in 11.2.4. So that was revised. And then the prepackaged workforce and CapEx are no longer prepackaged, but can be created if desired in the later 11.2.x versions. And if they were utilized with 11.1.2.4, then they could be migrated up to 11.2.8.
Right. Someone's asking about EAL. I don't know. They're asking, will there, I guess it's a statement, will be discontinued end of 2021. What solution can they use going forward? Now, yeah, go ahead.
I do not know the answer to that one.
I mean, I will say EAL is one of those tools that I believe technically hasn't really been upgraded since 11.1.2.2. Even though they kept coming out with a newer, they allowed you to download it. What they would do is patch it so it could talk to like the latest version of HFM. But my guess is since the HFM APIs haven't really changed much, it probably will still work, but it most likely won't be supported after 2021.
Yeah, I doubt it too.
I think that's it. I think that's it for the answers.
Okay. Sounds
for
good.
The questions, rather.
Thank you, everyone, for participating. And as we said in the beginning, if you have any follow-up questions, you can always send them to Interrel, and we will respond as soon as possible. Thank you, and have a great day.